each of the trips that we're talking about this year, we did last year in 2019, and each of them had a focus. And the focus for the trip to Japan was Leah's 70th birthday. And as I said before, my gift to her was to curate the trip, and she didn't really know what we were doing from one day to the next, and it all unfolded. And my actual gift to her was I actually included a few things in the trip that I knew she wanted to see. So
how generous.
So we're going to, you may recall that we finished off having arrived in Kanazawa, and
before you go on, our apologies to any Japanese speakers. We may be saying it like Ballarat instead of Ballarat. We're not obviously familiar with how it's pronounced, so we must apologise for the way we're pronouncing some of these names.
That's right. It's all in Yiddish. So we arrived in Kanazawa in the afternoon, and were greeted by this wonderful gate at the train station. And this gate is known as a Sumi-mon, which means drum gate. And the reason it's called a drum gate is because it's actually fashioned like a traditional Japanese drum. And it's also in the shape of a torii gate, which is the gates that greet you when you enter a Shinto shrine, implying that there is something sacred about this journey. And so Kanazawa, we chose this for, I chose this for two reasons. One, to satisfy my urges, which was to see the 21st century Museum of Contemporary Art, and for Leah was to introduce her to the KENROKU-EN gardens, because she's a nature person and I'm not. Kanazawa is located on the north coast of the largest island, which is Honshu, and it's got some distinctive features, namely some Edo districts, which were geisha and samurai districts dating back to the original timing, the beautiful gardens as well, including the castle, and some great museums. So normally I like to talk about the hotel that we stayed in, but the one we stayed in Kanazawa was a little bit underwhelming, so we'll skip that and move on. So when we arrived that afternoon, we actually walked to have a look at the 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art. And this was designed by Sana, whose principals are Kenzuya Shijima and Ruya Nishizawa. Now, you would have recalled they were the ones who actually designed one of the buildings in Naoshima that we saw at the last talk, and they are very well known for contemporary museum design. And they're currently designing the extension to the New South Wales Gallery of Art. This particular museum was actually garnered a lot of world attention because it's actually a new approach to museum design. And you can see from the shape, it's got a very distinctive circular shape with all these modules inside it. And it's transparent. When you compare it to, say, the NGV, which is built like a fortress, you can see that it's got a totally different approach, and it's actually designed a little bit like a community centre, so you can actually enter at 4 different points. And there are a lot of community facilities there, like a creche and meeting rooms and a library and relaxation areas. And then there's some areas where the art is, which you have to pay for. And you can see the design. It's sort of a series of boxes that have been dropped into this circular drum, and it's quite distinctive. And it's totally surrounded by glass onto this parkland setting. And even the architecture has actually been adopted as part of their logo. So it was interesting to have a look, but for us it was a little bit below expectation. One of the problems with having high expectations is inevitably you're disappointed, and unfortunately a little bit sterile inside.
A little bit sterile.
Well, yeah, and it was a little bit of a rabbit warren as well in terms of orientating yourself. But so you get a feeling in the public spaces as you walk around, you get this beautiful views to the park. And they had a lot of sculptures in the park which you could look at, like this spherical one, which is actually designed by the architects for the 10th anniversary. And it's also playing with perception. So it's great for Instagram because there's Leah and I photographed, and you can actually view it from inside the museum. They've got a beautiful restaurant, cafe, and you can see they've even got some large murals within the circulation space, and a great library to look at art books and art magazines. And they've also appointed several international artists to do major installations, like this one's by James Turrell, which is called Blue Sky.
Original title.
Original title, that's right. And they've got another one, like this one here is by Olafur Eliasson, who's a very famous international Scandinavian artist. And you can see again they're playing with perceptions, looking through the colour glass both into the sculpture and looking from inside out. And this one, there is a swimming pool, which is by Leandro Ehrlich, called Swimming Pool, which is a very original name. And again, it's playing with illusions. So you can actually walk from the basement into the inside the swimming pool, where there's no water, and you have the illusion of having water with this sort of glass roof with some water on top of it. So you can actually, from the courtyard, you can look down at the pool and see people wandering around. But the highlight was this work here, which was a temporary work, and that was a work by a Japanese artist called Noah Kohei. And I don't know if you remember, but I think a year or two ago, NGV had a sculpture of a deer that was actually composed of glass spheres. And this is the work that he does. So his art practice is about using pixels and cells and small elements to actually create the forms. But here, this work was a series of soap bubbles, actually, and it was constantly changing. And
I think the light was changing it too.
And the eerie blue light made it really quite an experience. So that was really quite terrific. But I think the highlight for us in Kanazawa was discovering this museum. This wasn't on our list when we travelled there.
And Charles tells me we're going to the Suzuki Museum, and I thought, what? I'm not into cars, because that's what I thought he meant.
No, she drives Suzuki, by the way.
And then I thought, oh, maybe it's the music. But I thought, why on earth would he take me to the Suzuki Museum? Well, now you'll discover why.
Okay, so the Suzuki Museum is actually in honour of a well-known...
wasn't so well-known to me.
Well-known philosopher in Zen and Far Eastern philosophy called D.T. Suzuki, and the reason the museum's there is that he was actually born in Kanazawa, and this museum was actually built not far from where he was born.
In a very small, very uninspiring residential street. So it may look quite, grand here, but next door are just little suburban houses, which is often the case with museums in Japan.
So he was born in 1870 and he lived to be 96. And what he's famous for is actually introducing Zen Buddhism to the West. He taught at Columbia University in the 50s, and his philosophy had a huge influence. As you may, if you remember back to the 60s, Buddhism had a major influence with the Beatles, and you have books like The Zen of Motorcycle Maintenance. And that was a lot to do with him because he was quite fluent in English. And in fact, his wife was an American theosophist. Now, this was also designed by one of my favorite Japanese architects called Yoshio Taguchi. And he's well known because he was the architect for the extension to MoMA in New York. And he was saying, because I read the book on this particular project, and he was sort of saying one of the difficulties in designing a museum for Suzuki was that in fact there was little material to display. All he had was some personal effects and some books that he wrote.
And also, how do you express philosophy?
That's right. That's so you can see from this interior shot here is that it's really quite sparse. And so what Taguchi decided to do was to actually design a building and setting which some ways represented the philosophy that Suzuki was expanding, and I think he achieved this because it's the most exquisite building, really the highlight of our trip. Sorry, to just go back, you can see I've included some of the quotes from his work, one on art and one on travel, which is quite quite relevant. So I'm an artist at living. My work of art is my life. And when travelling is made too easy and comfortable, its spiritual meaning is lost. This may be called sentimentalism, but a certain sense of loneliness engendered by travelling leads one to reflect upon the meaning of life. For life is, after all, a travelling from one unknown to another. That's what we find, Lee and I, when we travel with each other. We really get to know each other. Being 24/7.
The unknown to the unknown.
Yeah. Which sometimes takes me back to this other quote, which is, as you know, people who visited JAHM know that I'm big into nothingness. And so here we have emptiness, which is conceptually liable to be mistaken for sheer nothingness, is in fact the reservoir for infinite possibilities, which sums me up terrific. Both the emptiness and the nothingness business.
No, but there is something about this place that I don't think the photos capture it, where there's this just expanse of water, the sound of the birds, there's this gentle drip, just water rippling, and it's just serene. I mean, it's serene, and there's really nothing there to actually attract you other than just some hard geometric edges. But it just stills you. It certainly stilled me. I know you're ready to leave after.
That's right.
I was ready to go after about 5 hours. He was ready to go after about 10 minutes.
No, that's not true.
No, that's not true. But it's absolutely an exquisite place. So if you're ever in the hood, we can't recommend it highly enough. It's just exquisite.
That's right. So just to show you what an amazing building was, that anything that can still Leah, I think. So what he talked about was the approach to design. So in fact, the building is in 3 parts and 3 wings. There's the entrance wing, there's the exhibition space wing, and the contemplation space, which is this space here, which is actually superb. You can actually sit there quietly and actually meditate with all these selected views of different parts of the garden. And then the garden is 3 parts of the vestibule garden, the water mirror garden, and the roji, which is a dewy garden, which I sort of wasn't aware of. But you can see this building here. This is the contemplation building, and you can see the little areas like this little platform that you can walk around and stand right in the middle of the water. And so I don't know if you're familiar with Zen gardens, but this has all the qualities of a traditional Zen garden reinterpreted in a contemporary form, with a borrowed landscape and the water rather than the raked gravel, and it's just really superb. So in terms of the architect's and aspiration of capturing the essence of Suzuki, I think he nailed it.
So Charles said that one of the things that he was going to do on this trip was to treat me to some things that he may not necessarily have wanted to go to, but he knew that I probably would absolutely adore. And so it was with this KENROKU-EN garden. On the left-hand side, you can see there's this pathway, right-hand side, which led from the Suzuki Museum into this most extraordinary expanse of space. It's actually probably not possible to go to Japan and not go to a Japanese garden, whether it's an ornamental, highly stylized garden, or the now very familiar Zen garden with its emphasis on the stone and the minimalist aesthetic. In Japan, the garden represents nature and is regarded as sacred. The Shinto traditions revere the sacredness of plants, and Buddhist traditions see the garden as the recreation of paradise. And these KENROKU-EN gardens have synergized both of these traditions. The idea of the sacredness of nature and its sense of being a paradise is just exquisitely expressed. And this is regarded as really one of the 3 great gardens in Japan. The other 2 are in Okayama and in Mito. And you can actually understand why. The garden that we went to, which is a strolling-like landscape, was designated as a cultural property, thank goodness, and it reflects that 17th century Edo period, and where a local feudal lord will have established this beautiful expanse. And it wasn't unlike the great French and English gardens that were designed at the same time, that sense of cultivating something. This garden is built around a castle, the Kanazawa Castle. God, I don't know how we say that properly, but anyway, and it represents what's regarded as the 6 attributes of a perfect landscape garden. And you might wonder, and you probably would know that most of these are. It's to do with spaciousness, seclusion, serenity, scenic views, subtle design, and coolness. And that very idea of the borrowed landscape is also beautifully revealed here. The eye travelled where the foot couldn't go, which is a really classic thing in design. And surprises were revealed at every turn. There was a beautiful placement of small stone bridges. You can see over in the centre, I want the cursor, the support given to the trees with these bamboos, sort of sticks. Oh, hang on.
That's a support.
Oh, I'll have a look at. Oh yes, go back a minute, darling. You had people wandering around their huge gardens. You have a very dense map, and I took a whole series of photographs of people scrambling with maps to figure out where they were going. Even just to get out of the place was going to be tricky. Many people are wearing traditional costume when we were there. There were large groups of strolling tourists, but there was still this beautiful sense of serenity. They'd really achieved what they'd sort of set out to do. It was an absolutely exquisite space, so I cannot recommend it highly enough. Now, the notion of man controlling the environment is pretty much understood in Japanese garden design, you would see. And wherever we went, there were legions of gardeners, all dressed in this sort of uniform. You can see the sort of precision with which they're tending just a small area. They would pull out these small weeds from this little part of ground cover. They'd be brushing stray leaves. It was just extraordinary, the dedication that they had. And there was something quite zen in just sitting and watching them, which is what we did for quite a lot of the time. It was really very beautiful. To exit was its own challenge. And luckily, Charles managed to find a way out because there's only so much garden you can take. But I have to say, we had just arrived here after we'd been at Naoshima, which is a completely different kind of garden space. And it was really a beautiful sensory overload, really beautiful sensory overload. But my fearless navigator needed to get some more urban concrete kind of feel. So we left the gardens after probably 4 or 5 hours.
That's not true at all.
I know, we were still there.
The 2 other monumental gardens there was one associated with Kanazawa Castle, and then there was another garden behind that again. So I think, look, to be quite honest, this whole day was a Lear day. So within the garden, there's the Shurugate Tea House. This was originally built as a villa, and it goes back a long way to 1676 and took on some other forms of life. But in 2000, it was actually renovated as a tea house. And most Japanese gardens have a tea house, usually a lot smaller, and where the host or the owner would actually retire to enjoy a Japanese tea ceremony, which I don't know if you've ever been participated in one. Is a sort of highly ritualized and ceremonial process, and having a cup of tea can take hours, which is not the way Lee and I drink tea. We sort of wish through 3 or 4 glasses in no time. So even here, which was sort of like a modified form of a tea ceremony with these ladies in their kimonos serving tea. So here they serve tea with some confectionery, and you can see the people sitting there.
We couldn't get up. You know, one of the reasons we couldn't get up was with pins and needles.
Yeah, our legs were cramped up, so we were sort of stuck there. But it was a wonderful experience. You can see here even the way the landscape has been framed by the openings, and even stepping out onto the balcony through these beautiful details. The details between inside and outside with all these different layers of materiality is really beautiful. But it was a terrific experience.
You managed to find the only concrete you sort of shot in this entire garden. How did you do that?
Well, you have to try to explain how these things work.
Okay.
But if you look at the architecture here, you can see it's sort of like timeless. It sort of goes back a long way. And also one of the things that one of the points we made in the last talk was just how compatible traditional Japanese architecture is with sort of modernism, particularly mid-century modernism, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
So Kanazawa is one of those places that often goes under the radar with tourists. You know, if you're going to go to Japan, you're going to visit Tokyo, you're going to go to Kyoto, but it's unlikely that you're going to come to Kanazawa on the very first visit. But it really does offer its own treasures. It was a city that actually was originally a castle town in the 16th century, and it survived the Second World War without a scratch. And it means that the city has retained the layout of the roads and the Edo period architecture that defined the look of feudal Japan. And that's highlighted by you can see the architectural design of the buildings that are over there, the stone paved streets. And these are what are known as sort of the tea district, the geisha tea houses, and they rank among the nation's most photographed areas for just that reason, and they're rightly regarded as a cultural asset. Wandering here is like any, I suppose, any heritage district anywhere in the world, but it's unlikely that, you know, if you're going to go to Ballarat, having mentioned it before, that when you're going to see somebody dressed up there, they're usually part of Sovereign Hill, perhaps. Here, people are wandering around in geisha in gear like this, because kimonos, because in fact that's what they wear. These were just a group of young girls. I loved the juxtaposition of the iPhones, which everybody, of course, has, and they're ubiquitous, with these wonderful traditional costumes. And so you really get a sense of what it must have been like at a time when the geisha was kind of thriving. It's very much a place for bridal photos, and on the right you can see in an exquisite rich red gown a young couple are having a photograph taken. Unlike most heritage towns that, you know, we tend to visit, it's so unsullied by tourism, I suppose, by souvenir shops, by all the dross that often is associated with these places, where they're trying to milk every yen, I suppose. And so you really can wander through that place and feel that you're in another particular era. It's interesting, in Japan, there's a wonderful book called Lost in Japan, which was written by a Sinophile, a fellow who lived in China and then lived in Japan for a long time. And in the 1950s, his name's Alex Kerr, and in the 1950s, he was living in Japan, and he noticed that, in fact, and I think he was living in a rural part, on the nature strips, there were lots and lots of discarded bedheads or pieces of the frame of a house or lacquerware. And of course, for him, he'd come from England. For him, this was exotic. So the people who were living there at that time, it was post-war, they wanted to modernise. And so, of course, all these things were things that they had to actually get rid of. And he acquired a huge amount of stuff and became a very successful antique dealer. Happily, this has been regarded as a heritage area, and really still retains its authenticity. But, you know, somebody's trash is somebody's treasure. And it's interesting how time, you know, in his time, he was lucky enough to acquire things that today would be regarded as state relics. Kanazawa, really, for all of these reasons, is probably one of the most photographed areas in Japan. And so again, if you're ever revisiting, it's a beautiful place to come to.
Okay, so we actually were less than 48 hours in Kanazawa, and so we hopped on a bullet train to come to Tokyo. So this is our third trip to Japan, the third time we've been to Tokyo. But one thing that's interesting is that all the things that you see both in this talk and the last talk is stuff that we saw for the first time. Although I didn't mention a hotel in Kanazawa, the one in Tokyo, the CLASKA hotel, was a real gem.
Although it was a grotty area and it was outside of the centre of Tokyo. I know you chose it, but I'm just saying.
No, it was a great location. It was out of the centre. All the reasons that Leah had against it is reasons of plus. So this is about 6 subway stops from the centre, and it's a little bit like staying in Brunswick, and so it's a little bit sort of downtrodden in some areas, but behind the scene there's some fantastic shops and boutiques and really oriented areas. So this building is regarded as the first design hotel in Japan, and it's actually a converted 60s style business hotel, and I think it was renovated in 2003. And so you can see this is the outside of the building here, and they haven't changed all that much, and even the interior didn't change all that much, but they sort of refitted it with mid-century furniture, and which we love. Which we love, and which we have a lot in our own home. And in some ways you can see the point I made before about how sort of seamless it is with sort of traditional Japanese architecture. So what we're looking at here is a sort of lounge and bar area, and this here you can see the restaurant area. And in this alcove, which is next to the reception lobby, you can see all these magazines for art and design, many of which were in English. And here's Leah having a beautiful breakfast there. The food they serve was fantastic. And so having a 5 or 6 course breakfast, which is a bit more than our 2 Weet-Bix and a cup of tea in the morning. And it was a great place. So it's in a location called Meguro. And it's and then there's some really terrific stuff which I'll show you. And so this is our room. This is actually the actual room. There's only 20 rooms in this whole hotel, and each one is different, individual. And there's 3 types of room. There's contemporary, there's modern Japanese, which is this one, and also a tatami room. And this is me here doing my traditional scrapbook on our travels. And they also had on the first floor a design shop and also a gallery selling beautiful Japanese craft and design works. And so it was a really quite idiosyncratic place. And I don't know about Leah. I really enjoyed it, but the room was great for Japan. It was actually really spacious. Sorry, one too many. So one of the discoveries in Meguro was this place here, the Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum. This is near Meguro Station, and it's actually a huge plot of land, garden with this home and museum. And so this was actually built by the Prince Asaka, who was the son of, in line with the emperor, but he was sort of 8 down from the top, so there's no reason he had any claim to the throne. And so they sort of shipped him off to this area where he's given some land where he could build himself a nice home. And he actually lived with his wife in Paris for a few years, and he fell in love with French Art Deco. And so when he came back, he decided to build himself a home on this land. It was a beautiful garden. And so this plot of land here, I think this is about 3 hectares. You can imagine, you can see Tokyo and what an anomaly this is in the sort of density of Tokyo. But it is a park that's open to the public. And so you enter at this point, there's a new restaurant, which we didn't eat at. And so this is the original house. And next to it, they built a new wing, which I explained, in the beautiful garden. So you can experience the garden here. We actually went there twice. The first time we went there, it was actually bucketing with rain, and so we only did the inside and came back the next morning.
24 hours, yeah.
Next morning, it was a beautiful day, and you can see some of the photos walking through the garden. So he appointed actually a French artist to work on the interiors, and he also appointed a lot of French artists and artisans. And because it was a government project, the house was designed by the Architecture and Public Works Department, but who was also trained in European modernism. So they had no trouble actually translating the project into Art Deco. And you can see here, it's actually quite beautiful. Not quite the aesthetic that you're used to in Japan, but it does have a sort of degree of exoticness. And the artisans and artists from France were really quite famous. Like Lalique did a lot of the glassware there. And so I think this was converted into a museum in 1983. But then they expanded it by building the annex, which is this building at the rear where the gallery is, and they've also got a small cafe which opens out onto the gardens. And this was done in, when was it? 2013, yeah. So we had a meal, and even the meal, although European style, has got that Japanese twist to it. And they had an exhibition there. Oh, I should mention that although this was also built by the Japanese Public Works Department, they actually appointed Hiroshi Sugimoto, who you may remember from Naoshima. He was that photographer who did those amazing seascapes in a hotel. And I mentioned at that time that he was also an architect, although he's not trained as an architect. And so you can see the quality of the work that he did here. The exhibition they had at the time was by Moshe Kiesling, who was a French artist, and he was of Polish Jewish descent, and he went to Paris when he was 19 and had a studio in Montmartre. And he painted in the style of the early French sort of pre-Impressionists, Impressionists and Post-Impressionists in a period called the École de Paris, which went from about 1900 to 1940. So they had a retrospective of his work as well.
And now for something completely different. If you've been to Tokyo, you will have been to Takeshita Street in Shibuya, and if you haven't been to Tokyo, you will go there. It's a pedestrian shopping street lined with fashion boutiques and cafes and restaurants. And stores on the street include major chains. You can see there McDonald's, I think the Body Shop and 7-Eleven are all there. But really, most of the businesses are small independent shops that carry an array of styles. And the shops in the street are often a bellwether for broader fads. Some are known as antenna shops, which manufacturers seed with prototypes for test marketing. And I mean, what an enormous audience you've got to actually test the quality of what you've got there. It's filled with energy, it's filled with noise, and after the visiting gardens, you really get the sense that Japan is bipolar. This is a young person's sense of paradise. We felt both old and out of place, but it was great to see what the new generation was coming up with. Forget about Japanese reticence and self-control. This was outrageous. It was fun. It was crowded. It was blaring with music and shops touting all their wares in your face. It was just raucous, absolutely raucous. It's a world away from the refined palette and order of things that you expect to be Japanese. And I suppose, you know, the highly coloured junk food, which was absolutely outlandish. It's such a wonderful contrast to the sort of simplicity of a bento box with the beautiful sort of seafood things that are there. You've got Zen or landscape gardeners and quiet contemplation versus the frenzy of this street, which is the real Japan. I think they probably both are, but I couldn't wait to get out of there to the park that was just around the corner.
It should be noted that there are quite a few areas like this. Tokyo is a sort of series of villages, many of which have different personalities, a little bit like Melbourne in some ways. So there are fashion districts and electronics districts which are just like this. So Japan is pretty bipolar. And in contrast, this is just actually across the road from the previous street, and this is where the Meiji Jingu Shinto shrine is, and it was named after a very favourite emperor in the early 1900s. This was built in 1915, and you can see the Shinto shrine here and the Yoyogi Park around it. It's a huge park. It's about 17 hectares, and there's about 100,000 trees there, and the whole series of buildings. So, as I mentioned last time, Shinto is the actual indigenous religion of Japan. It's a pantheistic religion, and some people don't regard it as religion, but more as a way of life. And so Shinto deals a lot with the everyday, day-to-day sort of prayers and interests, and sort of weddings, and are very popular with in this shrine. So you can see from the photos, these are torii gates, which are sort of at the entrance points to all Shinto shrines. And here you can see a shop which is selling amulets and blessings, which you can actually purchase and take to the shrine. And here you have some sake barrels which have been consecrated. So again, the sake is just part of everyday life, which is forming part of the belief system. If we go across to the actual shrine itself, you can see these huge courtyards of people gathering, and here we have an image of a sort of traditional Shinto wedding. And there was a section here showing bonsai trees, which obviously have some connection to the belief system there. And it's also interesting to look at bonsai with in regard to Japanese garden, the way the nature has been manipulated. And Lee actually studied bonsai in her younger years, and she had this huge argument with the teacher as to why they were actually torturing the plants. So he said, "You did enroll in this class. You did know why you're coming, didn't you?"
I didn't last long, needless to say.
Yeah, she's better off torturing her husband. So on the right, we have a building that was actually just being finished while we were there, so we didn't get to see it, but it's also by one of my favourite architects, Kengo Kuma. This is a museum for the treasures of the shrines, so worth seeing if you come there again. So from there we went to this museum for Yayoi Kusama. I don't know if you're familiar. If you if you're familiar with Kusama, but she's a very famous Japanese artist, and she's worked all over the world, and she's famous for her polka dots. And we saw many of her works last week at Nayashima. And so she actually built this museum through her foundation to showcase her work. And
it's in the middle of nowhere.
Well, it's probably somewhere, but in Tokyo.
Yes.
And so it's a building over many levels. It's a very tiny footprint. And now, if you don't know Kusama, she's actually been around a long time. She was born in 1929, and from an early age, she had mental health issues, which she's quite open about. And she argues that her art is a way of dealing with her condition. And so even as a child, she used to experience visual and auditory hallucinations, and which led her to undertake this sort of polka dot. She's very famous for building these huge installations with mirrored walls and ceilings, which you totally get lost in with polka dots, some of which she's reprised in this building. That wasn't on when we were there. But you can see the effect of the polka dots in the entry here. So here she is. She actually lives in a mental institution and practices from there, but she travels all over the world. So it's a very interesting idea. And you can see this is the lift, and this is the toilet, and these are on the roof terrace, the pumpkins. And even some of the guests dress in accordance with the art practice that we have here. And these are some examples of the paintings, which are really quite exuberant. A little bit like Mercamora in some ways, a similar feel to it. So because it's so small, you actually climb up these stairs and come down the lift, so people can only move in one direction. And you can read this explanation as to what the museum is about. If you can understand it, please explain it to me. But these two works here are sort of typical of her installations. These are illuminated polka dot ladders, which have mirrors which take it to infinity. So it's really interesting. Not the sort of art that we're into, but it was an experience. Okay.
So one of the things that we really love doing when we travel, and it's not always possible, is to go to a house museum. So what's a house museum? It's where somebody has lived in the home. And this particular home is by a very famous author in Japan called Hayashi Fumiko. She was married to a painter, and she decided they would build a home together, and they would have the living quarters and a studio that would be quite separate. And she was not only a writer, but she was so concerned about the way this home was going to look that she actually studied architecture in order to have a conversation with the designers and the builders. She didn't design the thing herself. And she really wanted to sort of have an easygoing kind of aesthetic. Now, after all the hurly-burly of the sort of, urban Tokyo streets, you enter into this place, and I mean, you can see it's really like an exquisite sort of oasis. There were hundreds and hundreds of bamboo trees planted here, camellias. Things weren't flowering when we were there, but it was just a study in greens, I suppose. It was really very beautiful. I think Tokyo remains an enigma because for all the Japanese aesthetic, when you wander in the streets, there is so much that is garish. There's these light poles and electric poles that are sort of, there's this clustering of electric wiring to sort of keep it off the street. There's noise, and there's, a colour that's sort of, all disconnecting. And you walk into this space and it just is clean, simple Japanese lines. It was glorious to be there. We just sat in the garden and just recharged our batteries. Really beautiful oasis.
This is her writing room.
Yes, so she had a writing room. She used to receive her, I suppose, what would be called fans today, but budding writers would come to her home. She had a receiving room of some sort. And everything has been kept pretty much the way she wanted. She had a kitchen. I just don't think whether you have taken a shot of the kitchen. So she had a kitchen, which is for those days quite unusual, kind of an open kitchen that people would come and see. But wherever you looked, in whatever room that you're in, you'd have a sense of the garden. It was completely enclosed by that. It was really quite a beautiful space, and it's timeless.
So it's interesting, this brazier, which is inside the living room, is where she could actually cook a tea. And I think was probably done with wooden coals. So,
and these sorts of things are the things that Alex Kerr was talking about that were thrown out on the nature strips in the 1950s. A lot of these sorts of ornamental and antique sort of furniture. Interesting.
Okay, so as another experience, this is in a Chichi area in Tokyo. It's sort of like the South Yarra, which they had some really sort of lovely restaurants and fashion and design shops. And so this is the DAIKANYAMA-SITE, and this is a concept by a big company called CHAYA, and they are basically a entertainment retailer, which means that they sell sort of books, music and movies and everything associated with that. And they have 1,400 locations throughout Japan, and I think they are patronised by over 50% of Japanese adults in the 20+ range. So it's a huge activity, and it was just an amazing place. It's sort of campus style, so they have 3 buildings, and what they do is they actually have different sections with different interests. So which you'll see throughout. And so not only do they have the items I mentioned, but they also have cafes and bars and restaurants and this link, which actually goes right through here, where they've got magazines, so you can go from one building to the next, and this allows a lot of natural light in this sort of parkland setting. And this was actually designed by architects called Klein Dytham, who are actually graduates from the Royal College of Arts in London. But they came in Tokyo and set up a practice in 1991. So it's very unusual. They've got these European principles of a Japanese architectural practice. And they won a competition here from 80 architects. And you can see here that actually the facade has got a series of panels which are made out of the letter T for the name of the company. And so we spent hours there. It was just absolutely fantastic, and they've got everything from stationery to kids' books to art. You can see this beautiful mural that they've got up here, and going to the next slide, you can see they've got this bar made out of books, and they've got these exquisite Japanese ceramics you can buy. And in this section, which they're selling books on cars, they've actually got a sort of antique car in the showroom. So in this section, they've got the music area, so you can see a piano, so they must have small performances there to go with the music. Music was playing. And this section, they've also got art. And so what's interesting about this building is the way that art has been integrated into the whole personality of the building, both in terms of sale and in display. And there's something I'll talk about a bit further later.
Well, one of the other of the many courses I did in my youth was calligraphy. Needless to say, I didn't last that any much longer than I did with a bonsai. However, it gave me a great reverence for the practice of calligraphy, which is actually something that around 20 million Japanese actually practice. It's practiced, or it used to be practiced, by the samurai, the nobles, and ordinary people. And today, elementary kids, so school kids in primary school, take after-school classes in calligraphy. And it's an art form that, of course, takes decades to master. There was no way I was going to sort of stay the distance. And it's largely unintelligible to Westerners, as much because it's as much a meditation as it is an art form. And it fuses poetry and literature and painting into that one form. One ancient Chinese historian called it like images without form and music without sound. So it's probably no surprise that in the Ginza area, which is a very high-end area of Tokyo, there would be
this is like Fifth Avenue or Champs-Elysees,
yeah,
like the main street in Tokyo.
That there'd be a store dedicated entirely to the art of pen and of using pen and paper. So I think next you can see in the slide on the left the reversed image of Cartier, which is next door. So it's not an office works kind of setup. Every level is a dedicated level to a particular form. So on one level you might have envelopes, one level you might have papers. So on the right-hand side over here, it's like a Dulux colour card. There are a series of these papers in every kind of colouring that you want. This is the pen store. I mean, how many pens and pencils can you possibly have? Well, you know, they've got them all in this particular area. Diaries is on another level. Origami papers is on another level. There's this extraordinary diversity, there's extraordinary profusion, but there's this extraordinary order. You could find whatever you actually wanted. We went looking for origami papers for our grandchildren, for some of our grandchildren, and we finally found a whole cluster of things that we thought were wonderful. And you know what it's like when you travel, you think you found the one thing that nobody else will ever have anywhere. And of course, I was wandering down the street some weeks after we'd come back from Japan, and I found all those origami papers in the stationery store in Hawthorne. So, you know, that's travel for you. But the experience of going there was really quite something. On every level, you know, you stepped out and it was filled with people just enjoying the selection process as much as actually the purchase of it too, because there was so much to choose from. So that was an interesting space to go to.
Yeah, paper is a huge thing in Japanese culture, and I don't know if you've ever bought anything from a Japanese shop. The way they wrap it is just exquisite, and the store also had a gallery sort of showcasing new directions in sort of paper and associated artworks. And if you think this is it, like a 7-story building dedicated to paper, there's actually another building next to it behind the lane, which had another section. And so it was absolutely huge, just to show you the concentration with regard to something as simple as paper. Okay, so I think this is the next day. We went to the ASAKURA Museum. This was in an area a little bit out of the centre of Tokyo, and so this is actually a house museum as well, and it was the studio home of Isao Asakura, who lived from 1883 to 1965, and he's particularly famous because he basically introduced Western style sculpture to Japan, and he was commissioned to do major bronze works. And so what's interesting about this building is that it's both his home and studio. And the studio is definitely very European or Western in style. And the home is very Japanese. And the two live side by side. So you can see up here, this is a library. He had an extensive library. He also taught in his studio other artists and sculptors. And the home was built around a beautiful garden, and as you can see here, central courtyard, and he had this amazing roof terrace where he used to grow his own vegetables.
And again, in a very nondescript street with a very nondescript sort of sense of place.
So it was actually beautiful, and on the terrace is this amazing bronze work, which is standing over the street like a gargoyle. And
it's open to the public.
Yeah, it's open to the public, like a house museum, and similar to the HAYASHI house museum that Blair talked about before. So this is in an area called YANAKA, and YANAKA is an area. YANAKA, yeah. So this is used to be a working class area, and it's not dissimilar to, say, Collingwood, which has been gentrified. And just to give you an idea of Collingwood, we found, I'd heard about Chibi, had opened up in Japan, and we actually bumped into a by accident. So Chibi is a cafe, restaurant, and sort of design shop, which was set up in Collingwood by a Japanese immigrant who came to Australia, and it was so successful he decided to set up the same store in Tokyo. And that's like selling coals to Newcastle. It was a really twist on reality, and you can see the street here with all these shops. And a lot of these shops are sort of like design shops because in the past a lot of artists and artisans used to live here, and there are a lot of sort of craft shops and so on.
You didn't mention if you go up about 100 steps up to get to it.
I don't remember that bit.
You don't?
No. And here you can have a beer hall, which is very popular in Japan. But the other thing that's also prominent in Yanako is they've got the biggest cemetery in Japan, actually, in that area. And actually beautiful. The Japanese cemeteries are really superb. And
many of them, they're so ancient.
Yeah, and they go back a long way. And apparently these trees are cherry blossom trees, so they also, at the right season, will be quite amazing. And and then we have this temple here, which is Tennoji Temple, which actually was established in 1274. And what's beautiful about it, you can see, is that they've actually integrated all this modern architecture with the buildings that go back all that time. And this Buddha, I think, goes back to that time as well. So that Buddha is probably close to sort of 500-600 years old.
Do you remember how we got there? It must have been millions.
A train.
A bullet. Mostly.
No, it was a train. So yeah, it was, and that's what's great about Tokyo, is that they've got these little hidden gem precincts that you can go to, which are off the beaten track. I don't think we saw another Westerner there. It was just fantastic. Okay, so also within
which means you could make ourselves understood.
Yeah, that's right. So we had all hell of trouble finding this place, which is also in the YANAKA district, and this is the SCAI, the bathhouse. So this is a art gallery. It's a sort of non-for-profit art gallery that was set up in this 200-year-old bathhouse. And and they've been around for a while. I think that was established in 1993, and they've had some really major artists, international artists who were working there, and two artists that we actually highlighted in last talk at Naoshima, Lee Ufan and Miyajima Tsuya, who worked with those LED counters, were showcased here. And this artist who's on display here is Tadanori Yoku, and if you may recall, he did that house in Toshima with the red wall. So what's interesting in these travels is how you crisscross across names that sort of come up again and again.
So we decided quite late in the day, I think we returned from there, we decided to go to UENO Art Park. Not a good idea to come to a park like this at about 3:30 in the afternoon, because it is absolutely huge. It's home to art galleries, museums, temples, a zoo, street entertainers, the odd proselytizer, and more than the odd crow. It's kind of like New York's Museum Mile set inside Central Park, but it's actually bigger than that. It's really quite extraordinary.
30 museums there.
There are nearly 30 museums there. And we, of course, sauntered in there about 3:30 in the afternoon. Delusional, but anyway, we still managed to have a look at some things. But it's really, you can see the map over here, it's really worth a day trip. It is a place that people do day trip. Whether you're a casual tourist or a culture vulture, you're going to find something to enjoy here. It really is quite extraordinary.
Also the zoo's there as well, the zoo's here.
Yeah.
But here, for instance, there's this gallery, this museum, which is the National Museum of Western Art, which is designed by Le Corbusier. And this is another museum by Taguchi, who we saw behind.
You're in heaven, weren't you?
Yeah. Well, we couldn't go into these because we ran out of time. But what we did do is we actually went to this museum, Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum, because they had a Gustav Klimt exhibition, which was fantastic. They had 25 works of his from his golden period. And then they had the reconstruction of his murals that were in the Secession Building in Vienna. So Gustav Klimt, he was worked in sort of the Secession period in Vienna in the early 1900s. And one of the reasons that they actually paid a tribute to Klimt is because a lot of his work was inspired by Japanese art, as were the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, because a lot of Japanese prints were being sold in Europe at that time and were avidly collected. Even Picasso collected them. So the Japanese aesthetic did have an impact on art practice in this early period, where they're actually moving into modernist art. So this is a building from the outside with outside sculptures. So it was really a great experience. So this
has to be the highlight of the whole trip.
Yeah, this is the highlight. So this is TEAMLAB Borderless. So TEAMLAB are actually the art collective that put this on, and this is in the Tokyo Docklands. And so the Mori, I think what's it called? The Mori Building Digital Art Museum. So Mori is a huge property developer, and he built this huge facility in the Docklands area. It's about 10,000 square metres, and it was opened in 2018. And you can see the queues of people coming in.
This is just entering. We got there early.
We got there early because we knew you had to get in early. Otherwise, you'd be waiting forever. And
when we left
the way
3
back,
hours later,
so,
that's the queue to get in.
So I think the queues were about, at that time, about an hour and a half to get in. And it was just
well, you'll
an amazing experience. So
we're going to take you inside.
So I think they have, in their first year, they had 2.3 million visitors.
Maybe they're still stuck inside.
Yeah, they're probably still stuck inside. So TEAMLAB, they were formed in 2001, and they international art collective, and the interdisciplinary group of artists, programmers, engineers, CG animators, mathematicians, and architects. And this particular installation has got 520 computers and 470 projectors. And it stimulates all 5 senses. And the experience here is just totally different because it is not only totally immersive, but it is also interactive. So within the building, there were these 9 different zones with different art type installations. And just to give you a feel of what it's like, we're going to play you this video. Now,
and if you wandered into any of those rooms a moment after what you've just seen, you would see something completely different. It's just forever changing.
Yeah, so what's interesting about this work is that the technology is such that the algorithm they use is regenerating. So basically, it's not on a loop. Every time you walk into a room, you'll see something different because it actually keeps on recreating new versions of the images, so reinventing them. And this one here on the bottom right is all these lamps, and they're also activated by sensors. So as you walk through it, as you come close to a light, it sort of turns off and then it'll turn off. So it's totally dynamic, and this one, which looks like rain, works the same way. So these
and you lose sense of where the ceilings, floors,
yeah, that's right. And so what's great about this is not only is it ever changing, but it's also interactive. So you, as the participant, have an influence as to what's going to happen to you.
And it really doesn't matter how many people are there. It's a vast sort of space, and you don't even feel that there are people around you. You're just engulfed by colour, music, and just things just flashing around you. So you're not even aware of, those large queues that you saw there. You didn't have a sense of that when you're inside the space at all.
So this kids area was fantastic. So what you can see on the right-hand side here, these kids doing drawings, and after they finish these drawings, they can actually be input into the system and actually be projected as part of the display. And they've got another section where the kids were actually interacting, so they could actually play things which actually had an impact on what was being projected. So it was really awesome. So I'll show you, this video is particularly about the kids area.
And everyone becomes a child when they're there. Oh, it's just so gorgeous. Oh, I loved it so much. It's huge. I don't know how big it was.
So you can see here with this boy that the projection is actually working around him.
Oh, it's like going to a magical fairyland. So cool.
So you can see as he's climbing through, as he steps on one of those lights, it actually changes colour. So this is actually built in about 3 or 4 cities in Japan, and I think it's probably going throughout the world. TEAMLAB also do individual artworks which you can buy, which are also computer generated. So that brings us to the end of our trip to Tokyo.